And our next item, let me just gather my, is always a highlight of the regular board meeting, is the review of our CalSTRS funding levels and risks. And so we've got, let me just make sure I have the right thing up here. So we've got David and Jordan. No Rick today.
Rick is here.
He's here?
Yes.
But he's not here. Got it.
But he's not here at the same time.
That's okay. That's all right. Great.
Good afternoon. So again, this is an information item. So this is part of our continuous kind of work for us to monitor the funding plan. You generally see us for two big items a year, in May for the valuation and in November for our review of CalSTRS funding levels and risk. And this is a report where we sort of purposely look at potential negative events, just to kind of test our funding plan and how well it does in certain conditions, under certain events, and what maybe could prevent us from reaching full funding. So this is what we're going to talk about today. And as you know, our funding plan is extremely complex. So just as we start, I think it's important for all of us to, just want all of you to remember sort of how our funding plan is structured. So when you hear about our unfunded liability, we have rules in the funding plan that basically tells us how to break it into components. So I just kind of wanted to show you something we showed you earlier this year, just so you see it again, kind of how we allocate the various components of our unfunded liability. The state generally is responsible for what we call the unfunded liability for the benefits that were in place in the 1990s, so the 1990 benefit structure. And that's for all service. And then you have the employers that are responsible, if you want, for all of the benefit enhancements that took place in the early 2000s and late 90s. But when the funding plan was adopted, it limited this to service up to 2014. And you've heard us use the term unallocated before. Again, that's the little part right now for which, as a board, you don't have any authority or ability to adjust contribution rates to eliminate. So today we're going to focus a lot on whether the ability you have as a board is sufficient to eliminate the blue part, the state, and the orange part, the employers. And to do so, what the legislature provided you is this. To eliminate the state's share of the unfunded liability, the authority you have, which you have already exercised 3 times so far, is to increase the state rate by no more than 0.5% of payroll in a single year. So we've done that already for the last 3 years. On the employer side, we are still on the schedule that was set in statute. You have yet to exercise your authority to adjust the employer contribution rate. Once you do, that will be for fiscal year 21-22. The ability you have as a board is to adjust the rate for the employer by up to 1% of payroll, up or down in any given year, with a maximum of 20.25%. Note that on the state side, there are no maximum. So although we have the 0.5% per year. So this is what we have as an organization, what you have as a board. That's your authority or the ability you have to make adjustment to make sure we reach full funding. So now what we wanted to show you, so last May we came in front of you and we presented you the result of the June 30th, 2018 valuation. So this is just a little summary of what we showed you. Our total liabilities, our actual obligations were just shy of $300 billion. What we call the actual value of asset, about 190. And that came out to a total unfunded actual obligation, or often called the unfunded liability, of about $107 billion. And a funded status of 64%. That was what we presented to you in May. So today what we're going to focus a lot is on that 107, how can we pay it off? And if you go again to the parts, we've shown you this in the past, but the employers are currently responsible for about 2/3 of our total unfunded liability, about $73.5 billion. The state is responsible for about $33 billion, and we have a tiny little unallocated of about $300 million. So right now, when we're talking about adjusting, when we're talking about the contribution rates and your ability to adjust them, to pay it off, all we can do right now is the orange part for the employers and the blue part for the state. So this is also a picture we showed you last May. If you look at how we expect the 107 billion to disappear between now and 2046, some of the things we've highlighted in the past is because of the way the funding plan is structured and the fact that we have yet to collect the maximum rates from both the employers and the state, we were expecting the amount of the unfunded liability to keep increasing over the next 10 years or so, peak at about 111 billion, and end at about almost zero, but at about 500 million because we have no mechanism to eliminate that unallocated. So what we wanted to show you is last year, 2 events took place since we presented you with evaluation that actually impacted this chart. First, we had a 6.8% investment return for fiscal year 18-19. This is, I think, for me, working in public sector, this is the closest I've ever seen a system being on a return-wise close to their assumed return. We just missed the mark of the 7%, but because we just missed it, it's going to cause slight increases in rates. But what really made a big difference this year is the budget that the legislature and Governor Newsom passed, which included in it over $5 billion of money coming our way over the next 4 years. We already received $3.4 billion in July, and we have another $1.8 billion that's scheduled to come over the next 3 years. So when you factor all of this, this is how the picture looks like now. So you can see that our peak, so I'll go back to the previous one. You can kind of see now our peak is no longer going to be 111 billion. It's going to be lower than where we started. We started about 107. It's going down because we got additional money from the state, and now we expect it's going to peak at about 106 billion. But what I want you to also notice on the right-hand side, in May, we told you the unallocated will grow to about 500 million. Because we missed the mark and had just below our 7% assumed return, it added a little bit to the unallocated, and that number now is going to grow to about 600 million by 2046. Again, so you can sort of see if we were to earn above 7% this year, that number could be wiped out in 1 year. But it kind of shows you how that number will be quite sensitive in the future to our investment returns. And if we're right now, since we have no ability to eliminate it, the only way it's going to disappear is if we earn more than 7% on average over the next, through 2046. Again, this is just so you can see, we have our history of our funded status. And you can sort of see 2 dashed lines on the right-hand side. This is sort of our projections for the future. We just wanted to show you that with the additional funds we got from the state, we're now a little bit better than what we were projecting back in May. Again, the improvements are not significant because you have to keep in mind when your liabilities are about $300 billion, a $5 billion influx improves your funded status by about just over 1%. So it does help. But that's why on this chart, the lines seem fairly close to one another. So just keep that in mind. And the last thing I just wanted to show you were the projected contribution rates. So this is what we showed you in May. These at the time were the rates that were projected. The employer rate was projected to go up to 19.1%. That's what was in the original legislation or our funding plan. And the state rate was scheduled to go above 9%. With the additional fund that we received from the state, this is what we're looking at now. So the employer rate is scheduled to now peak at 18.4% instead of 19.1%. That was in the language that was adopted by the legislature in June. And then what we currently foresee is that the employer rate is going to stay at around 18% long term. And on the state side, what the additional money from the state did is it ended up shaving about 0.5% of payroll long term on the state contribution rate. So you can, if I go between both, you can kind of see how, and again, this is mostly a result of the additional money we got from the state. Good. So, which is very good. Very good. Okay? Yes. So you can kind of see. So if you look at the blue, it's about 0.5%. So that's the state. So this is what the additional money from the, but again, so you can see if you worry about, and this was something that we pointed out to the legislature when we went to many of the hearings. What we told them is, the timing of us receiving the money from the state, it's not going to have an impact on the state contribution rate until a couple years out. Because if you see on the left side, if you look on the left side here, the state rate is not going to change for the next 3 years. So what the state really did by sending us more money was to eliminate the need for an increase in the state rate 4 years from now. So that's sort of what it did. Okay. So now what we wanted to do, so some of you've seen our reports in the past. So we tend to focus on 3 big risks: investment risk, longevity risk, and what we call membership and payroll growth risk. In our presentation today, we're not going to focus much on longevity risk. It was discussed in the report. We feel pretty good about that risk because of the actual assumption that the board adopted in 2017, what we call generational mortality. So this one, we feel pretty good about it. Investment risk, I think it's, as you've heard through the asset allocation process, it's going to remain our biggest risk long term. So, and then we have membership.
David,
Yes.
On longevity risk, among our peers, would you say the majority of the market of public pension plans have adopted that generational approach, or are they still in a traditional longevity assumption? Where are we on that transition of that assumption?
So we, I just came back from a meeting of actuaries discussing the public pension plans. And it's something like 90% now have gone to generational mortality. And the rest think that their boards or their government agencies are moving toward that. So we expect that pretty much everyone will be going to generational mortality.
And if you look in California, I think all of the systems except one across the river has yet to move to this. But I know I know CalPERS intends to move to this new, they're in the process of implementing a new computer system that will allow them to do this. But it's become the norm now. Okay, so with this, what we wanted to do is we'll first kind of focus on investment risk first. Then we'll look at the membership and payroll growth risk alone. And then we'll end by sort of looking at the potential real-life situation like a recession. Because what you're most likely going to see if we were to have a recession, if you look historically, every time we've had a recession, we've been hit on 2 fronts: lower returns, and also, in some cases, we've lost some members because of layoffs and so forth. So we'll look at both individually, and then we'll look at both of them combined after. So I'll show you a chart that may look busy. So I'll just show you real quick what it means, because after that, we're going to go quick. So you'll be able to see how certain event may impact this. So you have 2 charts, a table, and some words. So it's a lot. So on the top left, it's our funded status. Okay, so we're at about 64% funded, and this is our baseline projection. We're expected to be pretty much near 100% in 2046. So that's the funded status on the top left. On the bottom left, you have the contribution rates for the employers and the state. We've only shown those 2 because those are the 2 that you have control over. On the top right, you can see the scenario that we're looking at. So this is our baseline if we earn 7% every year. And today, because of the unallocated, if you were to ask us to be super precise, what's the projected funded status in 2046? It's 99.9%. It's pretty much 100, but the reason we cannot say 100 exactly, it's because of the unallocated. And then at the bottom, what we wanted to point out to you, so the funding plan gave you authority to try to eliminate the employer share of the unfunded liability and the state share of the unfunded liability. So today, if you ask us, is the funding plan working? Can we eliminate those 2 shares? The answer is yes in both cases. The unallocated, because no authority was provided, the answer is no. So now what we're going to do is just show you different scenarios and just see how the information changes. So what we want to focus on, because I think a lot of people are worried about short term, what if we have low returns for short term? So first we're going to show you, what if we earn 5% the next 5 years? So I'll go back to the previous one. So what I want you to notice is 2 things. Investment volatility impacts mostly the state contribution rate. Again, just mostly because of the rules in the funding plan. So if we were to earn 5.5% the next 5 years, now you can see the orange line, which is the employer, barely moves. It actually goes in the downward direction. But look at the blue line for the state. It goes up to almost 16%. But if we're worried about can we reach full funding, we can still pay the employer share and the state share of the unfunded liability. Now our funded status is a little bit lower because of the unallocated portion. But you can see here again, most of the burden is on the state. Now, if we go to, sorry, it was 5% for 5 years. If we go to 4.5% for 5 years, now you can see now the state contribution rate goes as high as the employer, around 17, 18%. We still get pretty close to 100%. Both the employer and the state share get paid. The unallocated, of course, it's not. Now we're at 98.5%. But you can see we still have enough room at 4.5% for 5 years. Now, if we go to 4%, now it's the first time where we don't have enough room to eliminate the state share. But one thing I want you to see here, the employer share, in every single cases, we have enough authority to eliminate the employer share of the unfunded liability. So it's on the state share. When it comes to investment volatility, when we run into issues, it's on the state share. So you can see in this case, if we were to have 4% for the next 5 years, we would potentially come to you every year for the next 25 years or 26 years, asking you to raise the state rate by the maximum allowed by statute of 0.5%, and that would not be enough to eliminate the state share of the unfunded liability. So if you're worried about over the next 5 years, how low could it go before we have issues? Like 4.5% is how low we could go. Below that, we start running into a situation where we will no longer be able to eliminate the state share of the unfunded liability. So now if we just switch, same thing, now we'll look at 10 years. How bad could it go over 10 years? So we started with 5.75%. So 5.75% for 10 years. We would still be able to pay off both the employer and the state share, but the state contribution rate again would hit about 17%. And if we go to 5.5%, then we can't. So that and again, every time we can't on the state side, if you notice, if you look at the chart on the bottom left, it comes with a need for the board to increase the state rate every single year by 0.5%. So every time you see that, you end up with a rate just above 20% by 2045, 46. So that kind of shows you we have a lot of room in our funding plan. So it would take an extended period of time of low return for us to run into issues. Any questions on this?
Yeah, a couple questions. Dana?
So David, a part of the inability to eliminate the state share is just because of, maybe not just because, but the unallocated, the lower our returns, the higher that number is getting also, correct?
Correct.
So that unallocated grows and grows and grows, and that's part of the reason that we're not able to eliminate the state, correct?
No, so there are two.
They're two
So if you
separate
look,
things?
so we
Okay.
have so remember the pie chart I showed you. We have
Because
three
it's
parts.
unallocated.
So the unallocated keeps growing. We left it as no there. It will never get paid unless we have returns above 7%.
7%.
But right now, I think what we wanted to mostly focus is if you just look at the authority you have as a board. So right now we have authority to pay pay off two of the three parts.
Right.
That third part is very small. And so the question is that authority we have, is it enough to eliminate what it was intended to do?
Right.
So right now, so when it comes to investment volatility, if there's one thing you can remember today, when it comes to investment volatility, what we have on the employer side is more than sufficient. On the state side, we start to run into issues when we have extended periods of time of low returns. So if there's something you remember today, that would be the message I would ask you to remember.
And I would imagine that the higher that unallocated goes, or the longer the time period that we actually have lower returns, the greater our need would be to return to the legislature in a much more expedient factor to address the growing unallocated.
Correct.
Okay. What's our 10-year number now? I think it's somewhere in our materials, but does anybody remember what the last 10 years our return has been? It's under 7, I think.
It was just under 7. I don't know if it was 6.8 or 6.9, but it was
not too far under 7.
Not too far, correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Bill?
When you get to 17.5% on this last slide here, what number would that, what amount of money would that relate to the state? How much?
You mean in the...
And their contribution rates?
Money-wise?
Yeah.
It depends, so it's a factor of what your payroll is at the time.
Right.
I think you have to be careful if you're looking 20 years ahead, because you have to potentially add 20 years of inflation to this. But if you look in today's dollar, the
today's
payroll
dollars.
for the employer, the total payroll that we, for this coming fiscal year, it's in the $34 billion range. So you're talking about 17% of 34 billion, so a little bit
Yeah.
under. So for the state, it will be a little bit under, around $6 billion probably.
Right. So I keep coming back to this whole concept of, difficulty in projecting returns, but the ability to deal with the cost of generating these returns and the use of the collaborative model to reduce our costs, and where we can probably gain $200 to $300 million a year possibly in terms of reducing our cost of returns. It seems to me that if I'm a California state legislator and I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, well, how can I make sure that we generate, that we don't have to face this gargantuan number down the line? I want to make damn sure that the state is going to be able to avoid that. And what's my best insurance for doing so? It seems to me that this is a fairly compelling argument that the state really has the lion's share of exposure with regard to our inability to meet our funding plan. So to the extent that we can make, I think, a fairly persuasive argument that the collaborative model is really the best insurance for the state to permit us to have that kind of flexibility, seems to me to be something that we have to push.
Yes, and you'll be amazed how these savings would compound over time. You talk about billions of dollars over the next 30 years just by saving 10 basis points in your expenses on an annual basis. Okay, I will.
David?
Yes.
I've got one more question. Can we go back to that slide? Just, can we add one more complication to this for a minute, just so we all understand what happens? Because you're modeling sequential losses essentially here for 10 years, right? Now, each of these slides is modeling a sequential loss of a constant value. But let's take the more real situation where this is going to bounce around a bit, these returns. I'd like to just make sure the board and all of us understand the elevator loss issue here. Because you haven't demonstrated that, and again, the problem for us is if the state rate drops, it drops, and then we are handcuffed going up. So if this was actually 5.5, 5.5, and then a more positive number, and then back to 5.5, 5.5, this could be a lot worse, could it not, with more volatility in that return?
Yes,
because of the state contribution, I can't get it back up again.
Correct, it would be. And it's something we did not prepare for this meeting, but if you recall, I think 2 years ago, one of the topic we had in our report was path matters a lot.
Yeah.
And we had provided an example where in 2 cases, we earn over time exactly 7%. And in one case, we ended up at 105%. In the other case, we ended up at 90% funded. There was almost a 15% difference in funding level just because, and it had a lot to do where it depends when you have the losses. And then also, as Jack explained, because of how we can adjust the rates, and sometimes it just can lead to some of these situations. So that's why you have to be careful when someone says, oh, if we earn 7% over the next 30 years, we'll be here for sure. Not necessarily, it all depends on the path that we're going to take.
So if this was interspersed with positive returns, I might actually do worse, right?
Or worse or better, yes.
More or
All
less.
depends.
More or less.
I'm not going to pay you for that opinion.
Yes.
It's all right, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And you'll see at the end, we're kind of, it won't be exactly like that, but we'll show you what if we were to have a low period followed by a recovery. So we'll see, we'll show you some 2 real life examples after this, so you can get an idea. Okay, so next I wanted to talk about is something that we've talked about. I think we started to talk about it more over the last 2 years. I think historically most pension funds have really focused solely on investment risk. But because we have certain impositions on us when it comes to rate setting, and because we collect contributions as a percentage of payroll, we also have to remember that the size of the membership, of our active membership, the number of actively working teachers in California can deeply impact our funding levels as well. And it can vary substantially from year to year. This is a little chart to show you the number of active members we have seen at CalSTRS since 2004. So you can see 15 years later, we're almost at the level we were in 2004, a little bit higher, but we've taken a wild ride along the way. It went up to more than 260, dropped back to 410, and now we're back to about 450. What's interesting is the funding plan was passed when we were at our lowest. So what we wanted to show you today, just so you can visually see how number of teachers can impact funding over time, we broke it into 2 time periods. So we thought, let's look at the last 5 years only. So when you look at when the funding plan was passed, here you have a chart, 2 colors. White is what we've actually seen. So if you ask in 2004, the actuaries, Rick was here at the time, if you asked him, where is payroll going to be 5 years from now? That's the orange bar you see. So we have seen a much faster growth in payroll than we were expecting when the funding plan was passed. So you remember that chart I showed you of the employer contribution rate? When the funding plan was passed, what was projected at the time is the employer rate would need to be 19.1% through 2046 to eliminate the employer share of the unfunded liability. What has happened since, and we have seen a faster than expected growth in payroll, which is why now we're what we foresee as an employer rate closer to 18% because we have more payroll. So what we've done is we said, let's try to recreate the past. Again, I apologize, a lot of information on the slide, but if you just look on the top left first, what you see is the funded status for the last 5 years. The dark blue is what you actually saw. And what we did is we said, okay, what if the payroll had increased instead at what we expected? That's the kind of the dash bar, the lighter blue. So you can see in 2018, we would, if the payroll had been lower or as expected back when the funding plan was adopted, we actually would be closer to 63% funded than 64%. Because payroll would have been lower, we would have collected less in contributions. And contribution rates would be more in line with what was anticipated by the funding plan, closer to 19% for the employers. You can kind of see on the bottom right, what you see is the solid line is the actual rate that we're projecting, and the dash is where it would have been had the payroll growth been what we assumed 5 years ago. So we benefited over the last 5 years through a period of faster payroll growth because we had more members and everything combined together. It has helped improve the funding of the system. Now, if you look at the last 10 years, you start to see something totally different. If you had to ask Rick back in 2009, where do you foresee the payroll to be for teachers in California in 2019? His answer would have been probably around $37 billion. Or in 2018. And what we saw last year is it was about 32 billion. So about $5 billion difference. Now you'll be amazed to see how big of an impact this had. So we went back and we said, okay, where would our funding levels be today had the payroll increase at the rate it was projected to increase back in 2009? We would be about 4% better funded today, about 68 instead of 64. If you do the math, it's about $12 billion more in the fund, just from payroll. So that's why it's very important that we not only focus on investment risk going forward, but also payroll, because it can, over time, it can really compound itself. Because all these years where you get less contributions because payroll goes down, you lack the ability to invest the money, to earn investment income on it. So you can sort of see contribution rates had payroll followed the course we thought back in 2009, the rates would be about 2 to 2.5% lower today for both the state and the employers. So you can kind of see how big of an impact it had. So lastly, I just wanted to show you, so same slide you showed before, we just kind of wanted to say, okay, so now going forward, if we worry about payroll growth, so the assumption you adopted back in 2017 for payroll growth is an annual growth of 3.5%. So what we looked at is, okay, what if we start to see something lower? What if it was 3% instead of 3.5%? So again, same chart we showed you before. In both cases, we can still pay off the employer and the state share of the unfunded liability. But what you start to see, it's hard, you can see both the blue and the orange line go up. Now, what's interesting here, I want you to be fully aware, the unfunded liability has not changed. It's still the same amount. The dollar amounts we need to collect to eliminate it are still the same. They have not increased. But if the payroll is lower, we're going to need to collect a higher percentage just to get the same dollar amount. So even though it will be the same dollar amount for all of the districts to pay, it will be a higher percentage of payroll. And again, if I continue, if we have 2.5% payroll growth, again, we can still pay off the unfunded both shares, but you can see that the rates are going higher. Now the employer rate is approaching 20%. And if we were to go to 2.25% of payroll growth, now you start to reach a point where the employer rate goes to the maximum. And this is actually the first time ever where we run into a scenario where the employer share cannot be paid off. So if we worry about the employer share, our ability to eliminate the employer share of the unfunded liability, our biggest worry should be payroll growth, membership growth. When it comes to investment volatility, it's the state. So it's kind of interesting. But in here, like the key thing to remember is we're not asking people to pay more money. It's just that our base to collect it as a contribution rate is lower. So that's sometimes hard. Like people will think now we're asking to even more money from school districts. We are not. We're just trying to collect the same amount. We just have a lower number to apply a percentage to.
I'm not sure if this is a good question or not, but how does increase in payroll affect future benefits in terms of our exposure, I mean, our obligation down the line beyond 2046?
So anytime a teacher gets a salary increase, it will eventually get translated into a higher retirement benefit and the higher benefit payments we have to pay. This is something that we built into the funding of the system. Part of the actual assumption package, if you want, that you approve, and we will be coming to you in January of 20 with our newest study on the actual assumption. Part of the assumption you approve is one is inflation, price inflation. One is what we call wage growth. And another one is individual merit and promotion salary increases. So all of this is built into the system based on historical trend and also what we think of the future. So to the extent that what teachers get is in line with our assumptions, that it's already anticipated in the funding of the system.
So it's already anticipated.
It's already built in there. So it's all about, is what teachers are getting on average about what we expect? If the answer is yes, then you don't have to worry about it. It's built into the funding of the system.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. And David, I can't tell you how amazing I think you are presenting incredibly complex information. It's incredibly helpful. Thank you. A couple of questions on this issue of payroll. You note in the write-up that although it's not currently significant to the overall size, but the number of charter schools that elect not to participate in CalSTRS is growing, and that could negatively impact it in the long run, obviously, as we see with the payroll growth assumptions. So I don't know that it's a question, as I just really want to highlight that. And I don't know if I don't know. I mean, I know this is a really tough topic, but it does seem to me as we move forward with charter school policies, and obviously I haven't vetted this through our departments, but just to be mindful of that as we really try and see what just the status of charter schools and reform and things like that. And, if we could keep that in mind as you let the board know about risks, if we could really measure that, obviously you've started to, I think it's really helpful, but if we could really measure that growth and how, even if you're able to project kind of the same trajectory for the long-term impacts, I think that could be really usely to understand.
And just so you know, Gail, we actually have asked and directed David to do that exact thing, so you're right on top of it. I think we noticed a change after the contribution rates changing with PEPRA, and so I think David and the team are on that, right?
Yeah,
It's part of our speaking points now for the organization.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
It's a good
people just
observation.
think it's the same old, same old, same
Yeah.
old. And absolutely, this has taken a sharp
Great.
detour.
I appreciate
And
that.
people have to understand that.
Yeah, I didn't I hadn't understood that at all, but that was really helpful. And then just to, the 1469 funding plan, it is this shared responsibility, and it does include school districts, and you point out that school districts have been at like 18.1%. So I just put that out there. They're sort of flatlined. I just want to make sure that's out there too. This is meant to be kind of this group responsibility too. And, as far as we know, there isn't another infusion coming from the state. And as you point out, we're going to reap the benefits in 4 years. But at the same time, I do think we do need to really start to think about what that full AB 1469 funding plan looks like in totality, including the districts. I don't think any of this is obviously easy, and you point all of it out, and I think it's remarkable. But I think we don't see any school district sort of change, right? I mean, you don't see any, even though if we did see a change in the funding levels, it would obviously impact the long-term sustainability, right? So it's another place to look.
And on the charter school, just in case, so on TRB 96,
Yeah.
95 and 96 is where we have our discussion of charter schools. The only thing I would point out here is we have a chart on that table that shows the growth, sort of year by year, the number of charter schools who elected CalSTRS and how many did not. And last year when we came to you, we told you we've seen 4 years in a row where we've seen higher and higher percentages. Last year was the first time in 5 years where all of a sudden we saw a greater percentage than the last few years electing CalSTRS. So last year, only 20% of charter schools did not elect CalSTRS and 80 did. If you look at the last few years, it was above 30-40%. So it's hard to project into the future, but we have quantified on this page sort of where we would be today, an estimate of if all these charter schools had always been in CalSTRS. But what we have never done, and maybe we'll try to do it for next year, is I think you were asking more of a projection into the future.
Yeah.
And it's something that we could certainly look at to include in next year's report.
Right. That, and then, I don't know, Madam Chair, but just this question about school districts, because I do think, my guess is that'll come up, so I don't know if you're comfortable, or if that even makes sense, to look at, a slightly increased contribution of the school districts as well. Because I do think that was the intent of the law, is that they wouldn't quite flatline at this 18.1%. I know there's a lot going on in districts, and this would have to be over a much longer time horizon too, but I do think it may be worthwhile to include at least in a risk analysis, so we understand.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
Okay. Thank you. Again, I really appreciate it, though.
Okay. So with this,
I've got one more question.
Oh, one
for
more
David.
question,
Go ahead.
yes.
Go ahead, Joe.
Thank you. David, thank you again. I just concur with the other board members. The information is always really, really helpful just to see where we are in the status of the plan. So with the lower than expected payroll growth that we've seen, is that mainly attributed to a decrease in members, or is it because of lower than expected wage growth?
So if you look at the last few years, probably a combination of both.
Okay.
Just so you know as well, in the funding of the system, we actually have an implicit assumption that the number of teachers will remain about the same. So the 3.5% assumption we have today actually assumes that the number of teachers will remain stable. So if you look over the last 10 years, it's been fairly stable.
Okay.
But if you look at total payroll growth for the last 10 years, it's been 1.6% on average versus the 3.5% we assume. And I think a lot of it has to do that general inflation was lower than what we assume. We currently assume 2.75% inflation. The overall price inflation was a little bit lower over the last 10 years. But I think wage growth has also been lower. And this will be it's something that we are monitoring, because at some point, we noticed that the last time we reviewed the assumptions. We're noticing this again. At some point, probably not this time, but we are monitoring payroll growth, but we may reach a point where we have to ask ourselves, is our assumption too aggressive? If we're not seeing what we expect, is it a time to make a change? We don't think we're there yet, but it's something that we are monitoring, and you can be sure you're going to hear a little bit more from us over the next few years about payroll growth and whether we think there is a need. No, we've paid a lot of attention the last few years over investment return assumption, but that 3.5 payroll growth assumption can have as big of it can have a big impact over time. So we're going to start to monitor it a little bit more. We're going to continue to monitor it.
So it sounds like the information we're talking about today by itself doesn't mean that we may need to make an adjustment at our next opportunity, but we're going to have to monitor it closely. And similar to how you followed the generational mortality issue, if you see enough evidence that you'd make a recommendation, that's when we'd consider.
Correct. Because if you look at the last 20 years, we're about 3.4%. So pretty close to our assumption. Just the last 10 years, sometimes that's why I don't like when, right now, every time we look at a 10-year period where the financial crisis is, maybe you see things that maybe are not representative of a normal 10-year cycle.
Right.
So I think we're seeing that with the investment return. We're seeing that with the payroll growth.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, David.
Which, going to this, what we thought we would do for the last two slides is, so if you ask me, like, what worries
Ending with
me
this? You're
over...
ending with the
Huh?
impact of a recession?
No, I'll end with something
Like,
better.
Really? Sorry.
We'll make sure we end on a good note. But if you look at the last 20 years, we've had actually two recessions. We had the one that people like to refer to as the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s. Then we had the financial crisis. If you look at most recessions in history, you can sort of see somewhat of a pattern. You have low investment return, and when it comes to our other risk, payroll risk, we either see decline or lower than expected growth in payroll, followed by a recovery, where returns are better than expected and payroll growth is faster than expected. So we went back in time at the last two recessions and we say, okay, how did they look like? So it's interesting. So if you look at the dot-com bubble, we'll call it our scenario one, we actually had a 5-year period where the investment return was 3% on average, and our payroll still grew, but it grew at 2.5%, lower than expected. Then the following 3 years, we had 10% returns on average, and payroll grew at 5%. So you see a down followed by a recovery. Now, the second scenario we're going to look at is the financial crisis. And that one was really severe, as you can see. 0 return over 5 years. 0 over 5 years. That's extremely low. And actually, we had a negative... Sorry. And we had a negative 1% payroll growth. We actually payroll declined over a 5-year period. Then we had a recovery over 5 years of 9% return over 5 and 4.5% payroll growth over 5. So now what we did, so this is our same starting point, okay, that we showed you. This is where we are today. So what we said is, what if scenario one, the dot-com bubble, repeats itself? This is what you would see. Now, all the lines, so let's focus on the funded status first. So you can see we're starting at 64. We would end up somewhere close to 60. And then we would eventually still make it pretty close to 100% funded. But if you look at the contribution rate, you can see the employer rate in the early years would stay in accordance with our current projections, but as payroll starts to not increase as fast as expected, now we need to start collecting more from the employers. The rate will go close to 20% until the recovery starts, and then it would go down again. I think the main point here is if we have a recession like in the early 2000s, the employer rate is likely going to get pretty close to the maximum rate that's in statute of 20.25%. So that's the first thing that we see here. And again, the state rate, you can see going up to, again, 17% long term. But in both cases, we get pretty close to 100% funded, and both the state and the share and the employer share of the unfunded get paid off. But again, here the main thing is if we see a recession, employer rates are most likely going to have to increase. Now, the financial crisis. This is where, again, you can see funding levels would drop in the 50s. We would end up somewhere around 71% funded. But here's what's interesting here. Look at the employer share, the table on the bottom right. It gets paid. So if we worry about, is the authority we have to adjust the employer rate, is that sufficient to eliminate their share? The question is yes. Even if the financial crisis repeats itself, if the next 10 years are like the last 10, it will work. It's on the state side where right now we would need some more assistance. And we would end up at about 71% funded. So that's, if people worry about, if there's ever a discussion and there's a need to go to the legislature to make changes, the likelihood is it most likely going to be on the state side, not the employer. What we have for the employers is working pretty good. And with this, what I wanted to remind everyone, I'll mention it. So in our continuous monitoring of the funding plan, this year is the one item we do every 4 years, which this time around we've accelerated by 1 year to sync up with the asset allocation review. So now that you've adopted the asset allocation yesterday, we are finalizing the review of all the assumptions, demographic and economics, and that will come to you in January, where we expect to ask you to adopt the entire package, which means how long our teachers live, when do they retire, the investment return assumption, inflation, and so forth. All I can say so far is we're starting to see some preliminary numbers, and I don't think you can expect significant changes. You've adopted an asset allocation that has an expected return in line with what we assume today. It appears that the assumption we adopted for mortality is tracking experience pretty good. So I think there may be a little bit of a tweak. But one other thing, I just want you to give you a heads up, because we've done that with every experience study. When Milliman will be joining us at the podium to present it, generally, and it's fairly typical of when actuaries present a package of assumption to a board, you have to remember the 7% assumption is what we call the median. There's a 50% chance we'll meet it. There's a 50% chance we won't. So Milliman has done this every year in the past. They will probably include in the recommendation, here's what we recommend, let's say stay at 7. Don't be surprised if you also see in the report, board, if you wanted to be more conservative and have a greater likelihood of meeting your assumption, you could go with 6 3/4, and here's the cost impact. So you're likely going to see some alternative choices. They may not be they probably won't be the recommendation, but I just want to give you a heads up to not be surprised if you see in the report other alternatives, just so that if as part of our discussion, someone raises the question, hey, what if we went there? Then the cost information is already in the report for you to see. And if you recall last time, we had similar discussions with the board where some alternatives were discussed. And we just feel it's beneficial when the cost information is already in front of you so you can make a fully informed decision.
Thank you.
And with this, since we have a few minutes, I just wanted,
I do have one, actually.
okay.
I do have one question.
We have a question?
Do you want to take the question first, or do you want to?
Question first. I will end. I told you I wanted to end on a nice note. I want to make sure I
Yeah,
end on a
let's
nice
move
note.
beyond the recession to Lynn, and then to your, Lynn.
David, thank you again for the report and to your team. It's a great report and your presentation is always well received. My question is more that I know that you deliver this report to the legislature annually, but do you ever present this, like offer to present to them, either their staff, or do you present to large employer groups, maybe at a CSBA conference? Because I think it's one thing to read the report, it's another thing to have the back and forth and dialogue.
What we've done in the past is maybe present some of the highlights of this to key members at the legislature, some of our key stakeholders. I don't think we've ever presented to a group of employers. We actually started last year, Grant and his group organized a little road show. So we went in Southern California, we went in the Bay Area in Southern California, and we presented various information on CalSTRS, and we did present some information on our funding levels, what we see in the future. So it was part of it. So we are trying to reach out with some of that information to some of the employer groups and our key stakeholders.
I think that's great that you're doing that already, because I know that for the employers, sometimes, especially for the newer board members at the district level that may not be as familiar with the funding plan, and it seems like this is being imposed on them, but actually, a lot of thought, a lot of effort has gone into this funding plan, and it is working. So I think that's great, the more that we can do that.
I think we could do more, though. I appreciate the suggestion. We've been doing this a while now, since 2014, and probably it's worth applying some renewed vigor at times to educate those that weren't with us in those times. We probably should think more about that. Yeah.
And on a side note related to this, there is the actuarial profession came out with what's called a new actuarial standard of practice about over a year ago. They gave it a number 51. It's a risk standards of practice. And they basically said, what we do at CalSTRS was not worded this way, everyone should do this. So, so Rick was actually asked, that's where he was last week?
Yes.
He was asked to go to one of the actual conference, and he went last week to present the work we have been doing at CalSTRS with risk, so that the rest of the actual community could see what we do, and it was very well received.
Wow.
So
So we should call it CalSTRS 51 or something? Get t-shirts? That's great.
And that's it. And the last thing I wanted to say was this morning you asked if anybody wanted to come to the microphone to thank Madam Chair and wish her a good retirement. All I wanted to say is when I was hired 4 years ago, I knew I was coming here to help secure the retirement future of the most important people in California, the teachers who teach my kids every day at school. And all I have to say is I was extremely impressed the first board meeting I attended and how I could tell right away that every one of you sitting there lived our mission, and especially you, Dana. And all I can tell you is it makes our lives so much easier upstairs when we do all our work, because we know that what we care about, you also deeply care about. So thank you
Absolutely.
and good luck in retirement.
Yeah.
We're very
Thank you,
appreciative
David.
of all that work you all do upstairs.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, David.
Good luck from
Appreciate
all
that.
of us, so. See
Thank
you
you,
around.
Rick.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Now I hate to ask the question I'm going to
Oh,
ask.
One
okay.
last thing, I forgot my mistake. The gentleman on my left, Jordan, I just want to thank him because he's helped us really improve our report and what we do, and he's been invaluable into all the work that you see today. So thank you, Jordan.
And David, Dana has one last question, and I have one last comment, so.
No, thank you very much for your comments. I appreciate it, David. And you too, Rick. And if you talked about this during your report and I spaced out, I apologize, because, every once in a while I do that. In the report, you talked about another aspect of the compounding contribution rate volatility is the fact that we have a fixed time frame. And I know that when we did 1469, when we were talking about the solution, we played with, I think, what's called a rolling amortization rate.
Yeah.
If things start to twist, I guess would be a term you could use, and kind of go sideways in the future, would moving to a longer amortization period or a rolling amortization period help at all?
Yes. In reality, if you look at our current rate setting authority, it's working extremely well. I think the issue is whenever we run into an issue, a simple fix could just be, let's move it to 2056 instead of 46. So there are several things that could be done, but extending the time frame is one easy solution that I think at some point, even if we reach full funding, I think at some point it's going to have to be addressed, because what's currently going to happen in 2046, if no one takes any action, we go back to the previous world. And if there is another decline or some kind of financial crisis, then we would be once again in a similar situation with no rate setting authority.
And we still might have a substantial unallocated
Correct.
unfunded liability
Yes.
to deal with at that point too. Thank you.
And I just wanted to comment, I actually, and this might be your doing, Jordan, I don't know, but on TRB 75, I really appreciated the executive summary, I think. And I guess I just want to reiterate a couple of the points and the findings in the report, because, the infusion of funds we got from the state, that did mitigate some of the increases for the state and the employer contributions for right now. And being on a negotiating team for my local union right now, I know that at least gives us a little bit of comfort when we're talking to the employers around negotiating pay increases for our teachers. So that's good news. I also just, I think it helps me to think about those three buckets of risk: the investment risk, longevity risk, and the membership payroll growth risk. And it sounds like longevity risk we've kind of addressed somewhat with some of the assumptions we've talked about previously in previous years, but that investment risk continues to be kind of the piece, and then the payroll risk that we talked about. So I appreciate the way this report was organized, and I think these bullet point kind of key takeaways helped me synthesize a lot of complex information to kind of like, as a board member, our job is always to say like, what are the big picture issues? And it's to have oversight on risk. That's a big part of our job. So I appreciate the way the report was written, and so thanks for that. All right, thank you. We'll see you in January. Great. Okay, so now we have pension solution project update. Ashish. I think we've got Ashish and Prashant and Melissa and Graham. Just to keep us on time and on focus, we have 30 minutes allotted. It's always great if we have less than 30 minutes, but no time rush.
No pressure.
But just, I'm gonna, it's Friday, so we'll keep it, yeah. So got 30 minutes allotted for the item. Want to kick us off, Ashish?
Yep. Good afternoon. My name is
afternoon.
Ashish Jain. I'm Chief Technology Officer and co-sponsor of this project. Before I will start, I would like to welcome Will, who is now here. He will be in the co-sponsor with me in this journey. And I would like to thank Melissa. For last few months, she stepped in this role, providing all the guidance, leadership, working with me. I appreciate that. So let's go with the agenda. Okay, so we have a typical agenda, and Prashant and Melissa will go over, and then I will take over the next steps. Prashant.
Thanks, Ashish. So, Madam Chair and members of the board,
Exactly.
thanks for the opportunity to provide update. As you know that we have 3 function rollouts in the pension solution. And so let's start with the first one. The function rollout 1 is meant to provide the employer readiness environment. And as you may recall that a few months back, we introduced the regulation for new file format. And the goal was to get more complete and comprehensive data from employers so that we can provide better services to our members and employers as well. And our initial assessments tell us that more than 90% employers are likely going to be ready to test the new file format in next year. So that demonstrates or reflects the kind of support we are getting from the employer community, and we really appreciate it because we can't make it successful without their help. And the employer readiness environment is a non-production system which essentially allows employers and staff to work together and ensure that employers are able to submit the contribution file to us, and we are able to receive and process it as needed successfully. So that environment is really key foundation building block before we can deploy the more functionality in the production. And we are happy to report that we have this environment available as of last month. So we went live in October 7th with this environment. And amazing work done by not only the project team, but across the organization, across business areas, including Team CGI. And they have made this dream come true, in my opinion. Amazing work done, for sure. And we still have 2 more years to go in the next function rollout, and our goal is to maximize the use of this environment so that we can bring as many employers on board as much possible on the new file format. And we are looking forward to announce this further at least 2 times before the next function rollout so that we can provide the more enhanced experience to our employers in this journey. And there are some more exciting updates that Melissa will share in the upcoming slides about the employer readiness activities. Now, coming back to function rollout 2, this is the most complex and the biggest rollout for us. As you can imagine, it includes the benefit calculation, payments, refunds, and many more complex critical business functions for the organization. And for this function rollout, the key point is that we are in a very active testing phase right now. We are performing the contractor acceptance testing at this point of time, and there are many types of testing we have performed and we are going to perform over the next couple of months. Testing in general is supposed to is meant to verify that the system is working as expected. And in this process, there are 2 things which can happen. One is we are going to identify some design defects, which essentially means that the system is not working as built. And the second type of challenge that one can identify is we call it design gaps. It means the system design is not meeting the business need. So there are two things which can happen, and it's absolutely normal to discover those things in the testing phase. This is what the testing is meant for, and we are not unique, and so we are also finding some of those gaps during testing. And the reason it's yellow is because we are finding little bit slightly higher defects than what we anticipated to find. But the difference is not too big that we can't catch up. Team CGI has plans to recover it back up. As a matter of fact, we had the same situation in FR1, and we did it just fine. We were able to pull it back with additional resources on board. So testing will remain a very critical and important area where we have a lot more testing to do. And the key here is how many gaps you are finding and how much time you have at hand to really resolve those before you go live. And so far, we've been able to do just fine job. And there are things we can anticipate right now, and we are able to come up with the plans around those activities. So we will keep watching this area very carefully and keep adjusting our plans to make sure that we can deliver the system in the given time frame and the given budget that has been allocated for the organization to the extent possible. Going back to FR3, we are making good progress in functional rollout 3. If you remember last time in the board meeting, we reported that we were negotiating the scope and cost with Team CGI, and we were in the process of negotiation last time when we presented the report to you. We are happy to say that both parties have come to a successful agreement, and we have been able to make good progress since then. In FR3, the design is in full swing, and development has just started 2 weeks back. So everything going well in FR3 at this point of time. Okay. I'll be happy to take any question before I pass on to Melissa.
Oh, I do have, Dana?
So on page TRB 102, talking about functional route 3, said the negotiations are complete and resulted in net credit to CalSTRS of $940,000.
Yes, ma'am.
So what does that really mean for us?
So what it means is that, as you can imagine, that this project was started 4 or 5 years back, long time back, right? So since then, the business needs have evolved and are evolving. So, and two things happen in their journey. One is some of our needs may become obsolete, and some of the new needs may come in. So what happens that during the fit gap session, the requirement confirmation sessions, is that business meets with a CGI team CGI, and explains what their expectations are. And in that process, we remove some scope, we add some scope to make it more current for the business organization. So this credit is a reflection of what the net difference was at the end of those conversations.
Okay. What is it? And Sandra, you understand probably what I'm asking?
Yeah, when we negotiated the contract, we had negotiated $6.7 million of contingency within the contract. That just adds to that. So
we have more money on our side of the budget.
Right, to address scope issues as we
If something changes and it ends up costing more.
Right, exactly.
Right. I have a couple other questions. You said that 90% of the districts seem to be ready to go with the functional rollout 1. I will just say I'm really hoping the other 10% aren't made up of districts the size of LAUSD, that they're really small little rural districts that don't have massive amount of lines that they have to go through. And I don't know if we have any visibility of that. And I guess when we're talking about going from functional rollout 1 to 2 to 3, and I don't know who's the proper person to ask this, and we might not even know necessarily the answer between 2 and 3. Is the interface similar? So the product that we're using, is the interface so similar between all the functionality of the program? Will it be easier for our employers to adapt to using the product from 1 to 2, and then even more so from 2 to 3. So the issues that we might be having, or the employers having issues with it, might be less as we move through that transition. Am I thinking about that in the right way?
Sure. I mean, to me, I'll take a shot, and you can correct me. I mean, I would say our goal is to make the certainly experience better, no doubt about it. And during this transition period where we are already receiving files from employers, so they already have a baseline experience at this point of time. In the new system, we are looking forward to provide more, I would say, more easy to use systems and solutions, and more job aids and training about how to use it. And if you have any trouble, how can you offer more help? So I kind of feel that there are more help available at this point of time, and more user-friendly systems that we are going to offer at this point of time to make the lives better on both sides.
Thank you. And thank you for letting us know about the detail on that negotiations too, please.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit of context, the implementation is following the life cycle of the process, so that's why we started with the employer piece, and they have a huge ramp-up period. So they have the 2 years, and then they have 2 more years of waiver opportunity before, their implementation. And then we go into what our employees are going to be doing in functional rollout 2.
Okay.
So it's going to be an employee piece, back office, and then functional rollout 3 is the member-facing piece. So by the time we get into, so everybody has their own distinct pieces, so by the time we get into what the employees are doing here, the employer should be on a roll, and then the employees will be live, and then the members will be participating in the.
Super, thank you.
And if I can clarify one thing, just to make sure I said it right. We are more than 90% employers are likely going to be ready in 2020. So they're not ready yet. I want to make sure that I was clear on that.
Okay,
Thanks.
thanks.
So, and that really, your question, Dana, is really a good segue to the next slide, which focuses on employer readiness updates. You may recall that at the September board meeting, you all received a comprehensive update that included the history of the employer readiness activities. And so, as Prashant mentioned, the team has been really busy and eager since the October 7th soft launch of Functional Rollout 1, and prepping to further engage with the employers and get them ready to utilize that employer readiness environment so that they are more likely to be ready for testing those contribution files. So because of the comprehensive update that Jeff shared with you all last time, this slide is really focused on the key activities the employer readiness team is going to be focused on over the next 3 months. The first one is the facilitation of a pilot group of employers. We have confirmed at this time that San Diego, Orange, and Placer counties are going to participate in that pilot group. And really the intent of that is for CalSTRS to get reaction from those employers about the materials, the training, the employer readiness environment, so that we can better tailor those support materials for when we open up the readiness environment to all employers. Also this week, the new employer support portal went live, and the team is really excited about that because it really is a great tool for employers. And I think this gets to some of your question, Dana. It's a one-stop shop for employers that includes access to the employer readiness environment. It includes access to the learning management system that's going to be used to onboard employers to the new system. And it also includes access and links to the various support tools and materials that are available to them as they have questions going through that process. So the team is very excited about that. The second activity that will be focused on in the next few months is the soft launch kickoff webinars. And the primary purpose of these webinars is to provide both project and process updates to the employers, really with the end goal of encouraging the employers to schedule the on-site visits from our employer readiness team. And those on-site visits are really the trigger point for employers to begin submitting their contribution files into the test environment. So again, the benefit to CalSTRS of this soft launch period is having the flexibility and latitude to have a window of time where employers can start testing those files at their own pace when their systems are ready and work with the excellent staff and member account services that provide that more detailed employer support. And then lastly, the third activity that will be focused on is those in-person visits. And they will start in January after we've gleaned the information from that pilot group of 3 employers to help us really tailor the support materials so that we can be more successful when all employers start engaging in this environment. Oops, going backwards. And then I'm really happy to be able to talk with you all about the functional demonstration. So you may recall that at the end of the first fit gap exercise that CalSTRS engaged in with CGI was around the functional rollout to functionality, that large scope that Prashant talked about that includes employer contributions, benefit application, payments, and calculations. We agreed as part of that discussion to add 4 additional demonstrations of the functionality. Because that rollout was so large, we wanted to ensure that CalSTRS had visibility to the value we were getting as we progressed through that rollout. So we did add those 4 demos. We have shared updates with you all as they have been rolled out, which began in July of 2018. The demonstrations really were found to have met their intended purpose. I think the largest one is really increasing the confidence that the system we're designing is meeting the vision that CalSTRS had for the system. There are other benefits that we've attained along the way, some of which were unanticipated. Through those demos, we expanded the audience within CalSTRS. Initially, we started with just those that were designing the system because the intent was really to validate that what we asked CGI to build, they did build. But we've invited others to start attending those, and it's allowed for some additional change management and really getting more individuals than just those that have participated with the design on board and excited about engaging and interacting with this new system. This slide contains survey results from the 5th and final functional rollout 2 demonstration. And this one was extra special. It was a 2-day demonstration that provided end-to-end functionality. Again, for this one, we expanded the audience even more broadly than we did for the others. And so when I say end-to-end life cycle, it really took a member from enrollment through some of the complex scenarios that CalSTRS staff had some concerns about whether or not the system was going to meet that functionality. So we had a member enrolled who applied and initiated a disability benefit, who then went back to work and who later service retired, eventually passed away, and CalSTRS paid benefits to beneficiaries. So we were able to see how the system would work for all of those scenarios. And because others were able to observe, there was a lot of buzz in the building and excitement about how this system is designed. I really want to give a shout out to, there's project team members in the back, project team members upstairs. Team CGI and CalSTRS worked relentlessly to put a 2-day, 12-hour demonstration together for us, while also continuing to advance the regular project schedule. So I think that's it's a great feat and was a really good value, an important value for CalSTRS to realize. And then last but not least, I have to thank Ms. Karen Yamamoto for joining us for those demonstrations. It means so much to have your participation and your support of the project and the entire organization, as well as that, that support of the rest of the board. Yet Karen sat in with us and provided some feedback along the way.
Experience.
Karen, did you want to jump into this point?
Well, I just wanted to say that when I came in, I had no idea what the population in this room was going to be. And, but just to observe and just to watch it since I was years ago in the very beginning when I just saw how cumbersome the the screens were and how staff had to go through different clicks to get to a certain information screen for the members. But now to see how there were a lot of drop-down menus, how a lot of things were color-coded, how even the grid of following a new member to the actual, I learned a new acronym, NOD, Notice of Death, how that worked. And it was just really impressive. And everybody was really excited about it. And I was too, because it also provided tools, a toolkit for the employers to be able to click on if they needed more information, if they needed more support, if they had questions. So the employer had the opportunity to do that. And then I understand that later on, when we have members able to access the information, they have access to a certain amount of information. But then everything is kept track in an audit trail so that we knew where everything was coming from and who was making those changes. So that was really exciting. And I came away with so much more energy, and that all the more I wanted everyone to fill out their designation forms, because it would be so many more steps for CalSTRS to go through to get to the beneficiaries and make sure that those payments were made. So I really thank you, and I really appreciated the opportunity to participate. So
No, we
thank
really
you.
appreciate actually. You came in, spent the time. I think this team actually
Yeah, I
pump it
really
up. If a
appreciated
board
the
member is
hard work.
here, I think whoever is listening here, it's a lot of work
Yes.
behind the scene. And I
Yes.
think they pulled this off, and you came, and it was good.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't want to leave the slide without really calling out the excellent results from the survey of that demo here. So 97.5% of the employees that responded said that the demonstration met or exceeded their expectations. 92% then had a better understanding of how the new system will help CalSTRS to achieve the goals of this project. And then the increased confidence one, I think warrants a little explanation. It's increased confidence that the system will work as designed, and we achieved a 92.5% there. So that.
Okay, any question for us?
Bill?
As, again, just as a new guy on the block, I came here with sort of an investment point of view. And seeing this pension solution project evolve just in the last 6 months, and then seeing the results of this survey, this is really truly where the tire meets the road.
Yeah.
This is why we're here, and I cannot commend you and your staff more than to say thank you for really delivering. This I think this survey is a real vote of confidence, and I think that makes me proud that I'm part of CalSTRS.
Yeah, we are very proud. We have excellent, passionate team. It's very hard to get. I think they are, whoever is listening, they are 200 plus people, staff. Yeah. And it's tons of hours, it's a day and night, midnight oil, whatever you call, weekend. It's just so much going on in there, and then they just pull this off, it's just amazing. So if any question I will take. No. So I just, I know I prepared like 10 minutes speech for Dana and just cut off because Sharon is saying that we have to just get out. It's only 30 seconds, Dana. I think personally me, 6 years back when I came, you just embrace it, just like a family. I think technology services, technology is working fine, everything is good, looks good, but if something not happening, eyes rolls and all, but you all cool and calm. We have a situation here when audio is not working, video is this, but I think the staff really appreciate. And on behalf of executive staff and me and personally all the staff watching in there, I think we all just look forward to NIC, happy retirement. And I'm confident that this project will be successful and we will celebrate with you.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
I
can be technically challenged at times. So can my technology.
Graham, All right.